At the gala, when I pulled up to the front entrance, the attendant looked at me and said, "You can't park here. Please drive to the far lot." The words fell heavy, sharper than they should have been. Because it wasn't just about parking. It was about being pushed aside, placed where no one could see, treated as though he had no right to belong. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, watching as sleek cars rolled past him, their drivers stepping out to applause and umbrellas waiting to shield them from the drizzle. They were escorted to the red carpet, their shoes never touching the wet pavement. And him? He was waved away with a forced smile, guided toward the edge of the property where gravel turned to mud. The far lot stretched out like an afterthought, a patch of soaked earth where cold wind ripped through the empty rows. His tires splashed into puddles as he pulled in, the sound hollow in the darkness. No attendants here, no lights bright enough to soften the edges of the night. Just the sharp sting of rain against his coat as he stepped out, the smell of damp gravel clinging to the air. His shoes sank slightly into the mud, and for a moment he simply stood there, staring at the glowing venue in the distance, the place he had made possible, the place where he was already forgotten. From where he stood, he could see them arriving. Men in tailored suits, women draped in gowns, laughter spilling out as doors opened, umbrellas lifting them like royalty into the warmth. None of them turned to look toward the dark stretch of lot where he stood. To them, he did not exist. He wasn't one of the honored guests. He was just another car to be pushed away, another figure swallowed by the shadows. His breath clouded in the night air, heavy and uneven. It wasn't the cold that made him shiver. It was the sting of humiliation. He remembered the moment months ago when he had signed the transfer, the pen pressing firmly against the check that would cover the cost of the evening. He had pictured this night then, imagined the lights, the speeches, the joy on people's faces. He had wanted no recognition, no banner with his name, but never, not even in his quietest humility, had he imagined this, being shunted to the margins like he was nothing at all. He began walking, each step slow, his shoes splattering mud on his trousers. From the far lot to the glittering entrance felt like a pilgrimage through disdain. The closer he came, the clearer the laughter grew. He passed attendants holding umbrellas, but none were for him. He passed guests taking photos, their flashes burning into the night, but none turned toward him. And yet he kept moving, because though they had cast him into the shadows, he knew something they did not. One day, before this night ended, the same voices that sent him away would speak his name with respect. And no gravel lot, no rain, no dismissive wave of the hand could erase the truth waiting to be revealed. Friends, let's pause here for a moment. Write in the comments, where are you listening from? Has something like this ever happened in your life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. That's how you help us grow this channel. And now, we continue. At the entrance, the warmth of the building hit him like a lie. The golden lights spilling over marble floors, the air fragrant with flowers and perfume. Guests were greeted with applause, hugs, firm handshakes. Their names were spoken aloud, some even announced with flourish. But when he reached the table, the volunteer barely glanced up. A polite smile stretched across her face, but her eyes slid over him, as though she were looking at a shadow. Without asking his name, without checking a list, she reached for a plain paper wristband and fastened it around his arm. No engraving, no distinction, no title, just a strip of plastic, the kind handed to staff or outsiders who needed permission to sit quietly at the back. He stood there for a moment, the band cutting into his skin, and watched as another man walked up after him. The volunteer's eyes lit up, She checked his name on a list, greeted him as honored guest, and handed him a polished badge embossed in gold. His photograph was printed neatly beside his name. Ushers appeared instantly, guiding him forward, pulling him into the orbit of the important. The contrast was blinding. He tightened his jaw and forced himself to move forward. An usher nodded toward the back rows, gesturing to a seat near the exit, where the cold draft from the doors swept in every time someone entered. It was not a mistake. It was intentional. The placement of someone considered unworthy of the spotlight. He sat down slowly, listening to the rustle of gowns and the laughter of men who shook hands as though sealing invisible deals. From his seat, the stage looked small, distant, like a dream happening in another world. He lowered his gaze to the wristband again. A thin strip of anonymity. To everyone else, it meant nothing. To him, it was a verdict. You are nobody here. The bitter irony settled like a stone in his chest. The very stage before him, the chandeliers above, the chairs arranged in rows, all of it existed because of him. And yet, when the doors opened and the honored walked in, they saw him only as an extra, as someone who had been given permission to sit, nothing more. Around him, whispers and greetings swirled like smoke. He caught fragments of conversations, talk of sponsors, benefactors, generous patrons whose names would be announced tonight. His heart pounded, but his face remained still. He thought of the contract folded neatly at home, the proof of payments, the nights he had signed away his savings so this very evening could live and breathe. And yet, instead of his name on a badge, instead of a seat of respect, he had been given a plastic band that could be torn off and thrown away. He leaned back in his chair, the draft chilling his shoulders, and let the silence within him grow. There was no anger in his eyes, only a calm that comes when truth no longer needs defense. They did not know yet. They did not see. But the night was long, and truth has a way of arriving even when hidden at the very back row. From his seat by the exit, he could see the whole hall, people shining under chandeliers, proud of their borrowed light. He sat quietly, carrying the weight of a fire that no wristband could erase. He lowered himself onto the chair they had given him, a lonely seat pressed against the wall near the double doors. The cushion sagged beneath him, thin and uneven, nothing like the padded rows closer to the stage where laughter already echoed. Each time the doors swung open, a rush of cold air tore into the hall, curling around his shoulders and crawling down his spine. The smell of rain and the heavy thud of footsteps followed as staff hurried in and out, trays clattering, whispered instructions flying past. His chair was not a place of honor. It was a checkpoint, a waiting post, a corner for someone who was meant to watch but never belong. He folded his hands in his lap, feeling the chill settle into his bones. From here he could see everything. The grand chandeliers above, the velvet curtains framing the stage, the guests wrapped in warmth and admiration. They leaned close to one another, smiling, whispering, clinking glasses. Their world looked golden, glittering, unreachable. And yet, though he sat among them, he was not part of them. He felt like a guard stationed at a door, keeping watch over a life that was his by right, yet denied to him by their blindness. Every slam of the doors was a reminder. Each time they opened, the hall shivered, and he with it. The draft curled around his ankles, rising into his chest, making him feel less like a guest and more like an intruder waiting to be told to move. He could hear the shuffling of servers behind him, the hiss of rain on the pavement outside, the metallic snap of umbrellas closing. All of it pressed against him, louder than the music, louder than the chatter. It was as though the world wanted him to know his place, the cold at the back, the shadows by the exit. He glanced toward the stage, far in the distance, where the podium stood empty, waiting for speeches that would fill the night. The seats at the front gleamed under the lights, reserved for names spoken with respect, names that would be remembered tomorrow. His own name, the one etched on contracts, the one written on checks that had made this evening possible, was absent. He sat in the shadows while others prepared to bask in a glory built on his sacrifice. A dull ache spread in his chest, heavier than the cold. It wasn't the draft that chilled him most. It was the silence around his presence. No one asked why he sat by the doors. No one noticed that he was there at all. The ushers hurried past him, their eyes sliding over him like he was furniture. Even when they brushed his shoulder, they did not stop. He had become invisible, a figure to be ignored, tolerated, dismissed. And yet within him, something stirred. He watched the glowing hall, the stage, the seats, the guests. He let the cold bite into him, let the humiliation soak into his bones. But beneath it all lay a quiet fire. For while they believed he was no one, he knew the truth. The walls around them, the lights above, the very possibility of this night existed because of him. They had sat him at the door as though he were a stranger. But before the night ended, they would learn that the man by the exit was the reason the doors had opened at all. The laughter reached him like a sting carried on the air, soft at first, then sharper when the words cut through the noise of clinking glasses and muted music. Behind him, where the servers gathered with trays and staff slipped in and out through the drafty doors, someone's voice, light, amused, careless, floated above the rest. He looks better behind the camera than in front of it. The chuckle that followed was quick, almost harmless in their world, but in his chest it landed like a blade. He sat perfectly still, though his heart flinched. They didn't mean it as cruelty, he told himself. It was just a careless remark, laughter thrown into the air without thought. But sometimes the words not meant to wound cut the deepest. They exposed what people truly saw when they looked at you, or when they barely looked at all. He gripped the edge of his chair, fingers pressing so tightly into the wood that his knuckles burned. His shoulders rose with a slow breath, and he willed himself not to turn, not to let them see the weight of what they had done. In his mind, memories rose unbidden, each one an ache, sharper than the last. He saw himself years ago standing in a pawn shop, parting with tools he had carried through decades of work. He had traded them for money to buy his daughter the camera she dreamed of. He had watched her unwrap it with wide eyes, watched her hug him as though he had given her the world. That camera had been a symbol of pride, of sacrifice, of love. And now, here he was, reduced to the man who looked better behind it, erased from the frame of life he had once worked so hard to give. The laughter behind him grew fainter, replaced by the rhythm of conversations, but the echo of it rang in his chest long after. He did not need to hear it again. It replayed itself without mercy. It told him what they thought, what they had always thought. Not worthy of the photo, not worthy of the frame. His life, his presence, his name, too small to stand beside theirs. He looked down at the paper wristband, its edges already damp from the sweat of his skin. Plain, anonymous, disposable. He traced it with his thumb, and the bitter irony hollowed him further. They thought he belonged in the shadows, at the edges, in the background of other people's portraits. They thought his story was one not worth capturing. And yet, as he sat in the draft, the ache twisting deeper with every remembered sacrifice, he felt something shift beneath the wound. The pain was real, yes, but so was the truth he carried. A truth larger than their laughter, larger than their ignorance. The camera they mocked had once been a gift of his love. The hall that now echoed with their careless jokes was built on his silent generosity. They could laugh at him in whispers, dismiss him with smiles, but none of them could erase the foundation of this night. He closed his eyes briefly, steadying himself against the sting. The laughter had cut, but it would not break him. One day, before the night was over, the same voices that mocked him would be forced to speak his name, not as a joke, but as a truth that would leave them silent. They approached him with smiles so polished, they gleamed brighter than the chandeliers. Smiles that said welcome, but eyes that said, stay out of the way. Each time he moved even slightly toward the front rows, A volunteer stepped forward with a bow of the head, a soft voice, and the same rehearsed phrase. "Please, sir, remain in your section." The tone was syrup sweet, dipped in politeness, but the meaning was iron. Stay hidden. Stay small. Stay where you cannot be seen. Ropes and velvet cords divided the hall, thin lines of fabric that became walls of exclusion. He watched as others stepped across them freely, ushered with nods and applause, their badges gleaming. For him, the cords never lifted. The same hand that smiled while gesturing upward became a barrier, pressing him back into the shadows. Even the apologies were quick and weightless. "So sorry, sir, but this area is reserved," followed by another practiced smile that vanished before it reached the eyes. He tried to move through the crowd, but each step was cut short. An usher's hand appeared at his elbow, lightly guiding him back toward the draft by the doors. The touch was not harsh, but it burned with humiliation. Not one of them knew who he was, what he had done to bring them all here tonight. To them, he was another guest, without a name, an extra body whose presence had to be contained so it wouldn't disturb the choreography of the evening. The contempt was hidden beneath layers of courtesy, but he felt it sharper than open mockery. Open cruelty at least admits its truth. This was worse. It was dismissal painted as kindness. They smiled as they erased him, bowed their heads as they stripped him of place. Their civility became a weapon, a reminder that in their eyes he wasn't worth even the honesty of scorn. He was tolerated, not welcomed. He sat back down near the exit, his chest tight, his hands clasped too firmly together. He listened to the applause rising from the front rows as new arrivals were greeted, their names called out, their seats guided to the best view of the stage. Each name rang in his ears like a hammer, driving in the nail of his invisibility. No one spoke his. No one even asked. And yet, he let them push him aside without protest. He had no need to fight their ropes or demand their courtesy. For deep within, he carried a secret stronger than their polished disdain. He knew what the night truly rested on. He knew whose hand had opened the doors, whose pen had signed the checks, whose sacrifices had poured unseen into every corner of the hall. They were blind now, but blindness cannot last forever. As another usher passed, offering him a polite nod without really seeing him, he leaned back against the cold draft and let the silence settle into his bones. Their contempt, wrapped in velvet and smiles, no longer cut him as it had at first. It only prepared him. For the higher they built their illusion of hierarchy, the greater their fall would be when the truth spoke louder than their courtesy ever could. He watched her from the shadows, his daughter, radiant beneath the chandeliers as though the light itself belonged to her. She stood a few rows ahead, surrounded by guests who leaned in to hear her every word. Her smile glittered as she spoke of her husband's growing business, of the important people they had dined with last week, of the officials who recognized his name. Each phrase dripped with pride, each anecdote polished for effect, and the crowd responded with nods of admiration. He listened, not because he wanted to, but because her voice carried easily across the hall, slicing through the music and conversation, leaving no corner untouched. And in every word she spoke there was a space, a hollow, glaring absence where his name should have been. He had given her more than stories, more than introductions, more than fleeting connections. He had given her the foundation of the life she now boasted about, yet she did not see it, or perhaps she refused to. The silence around his name was not accidental. It was deliberate, chosen, an omission so loud that it drowned everything else. He sat still, hands folded, eyes lowered, letting her pride echo through the hall. To stand and remind her, to cut through her illusions with truth would have been easy. He could have named names, revealed receipts, laid bare the weight of what he had carried for her children, for the very roof above her head tonight. But he did not. For silence, when chosen, speaks louder than thunder. His silence was not weakness anymore. It was a weapon, a shield, a quiet judgment she could not escape. Around her, people clapped lightly, amused by her clever phrasing, impressed by the reach of her husband's connections. She glowed brighter, feeding on their approval, unaware that in her eagerness to stand tall she had cut her own roots. She thought she was rising higher than him, that she had surpassed the man who sat quietly at the back. But he saw the truth. A tree can stretch its branches only because its roots are deep in unseen soil, and he, unmentioned, unrecognized, was that soil. Without him, she would not be standing at all. His chest tightened, not with anger, but with the heaviness of betrayal. He remembered carrying her on his shoulders through stormy streets when she was small, her laughter warming him against the rain. He remembered saving his wages for her school fees, walking home in worn shoes so she would never know hunger or shame. He remembered whispering promises to himself, late at night, that she would live a life better than his own. And now she spoke proudly, yes, but proudly of others, not of him. The applause around her grew, and he let it wash over him like a tide. He did not rise. He did not speak. He allowed the emptiness where his name should be to echo louder than her laughter. And though she did not realize it yet, her pride would soon be tested, her shining mask stripped away. For truth waits patiently, and when it arrives, it silences every boast, every hollow word. He remained still, his silence pressing heavier than any speech, his presence invisible yet unshakable. Let her shine now, he thought. Let her fill the air with borrowed names. For the night was not yet over. And when the truth finally stepped onto the stage, the silence she had given him would thunder back against her tenfold. Inside his jacket, folded neatly in an envelope worn at the edges, lay the truth. The contract, the signed agreement, the receipts of every payment he had made to ensure this event could exist at all. Line after line, numbers carved in ink, each digit carrying a piece of his life, of the work he had given, of the quiet sacrifices no one had ever noticed. He had carried those documents with him not to flaunt, not to thrust into anyone's face, but because they were proof, silent, undeniable proof, that when the lights dimmed and the curtains rose, it was his hand that had built the stage they all stood upon. He touched the envelope lightly through the fabric of his coat, the paper pressing faintly against his chest like a heartbeat. A part of him longed to stand, to walk to the front, to lay those sheets on the shining table and watch the gasps ripple through the hall. He imagined the silence that would fall, the shame that would settle on those who had sent him to the far lot, those who had kept him by the exit, those who had spoken his name like it was unworthy of space. But he did not move. He did not rise. Truth, he knew, was not something to be thrown like a stone in anger. Truth had its own time, its own stage, its own power. He watched as the evening unfolded. The chatter grew brighter. The speeches began. The names of patrons and donors rolled from the lips of the host like pearls scattered before the crowd. Each name was applauded, each guest lifted in praise, their faces glowing beneath the chandeliers, and still his remained unspoken. He was not surprised. He had not asked for recognition when he gave, but there, in his pocket, lay the quiet reminder that recognition was his, whether the host spoke it or not. His daughter passed by, her gown shimmering as she leaned to whisper to a friend, her laughter loud enough to carry across the rows. He watched her without resentment, only a slow sadness settling in his eyes. She had no idea that the paper in his pocket carried her too, that the chairs her friends filled, the music echoing above her head, the food served on gilded plates were all paid for by the man she dismissed. She laughed in borrowed light, never knowing whose hand had turned on the lamp. He kept his silence, for silence was strength now, not weakness. Let them enjoy their illusions, he thought. Let them believe the night was theirs. He knew better. The truth did not need to shout, nor rush forward, nor prove itself prematurely. It would come when it was ready, in a way no one could deny, and when it did, their laughter would falter, their pride would collapse. So he sat, feeling the weight of the envelope against his chest, steady as his own breath. Proof, evidence, a legacy written not in empty boasts, but in ink and sacrifice. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the applause echo through the hall, and allowed himself the faintest smile. They did not know it yet, but they soon would. And when the truth finally spoke, it would be louder than every laugh, every insult, every silence he had endured tonight. Behind the velvet curtains, the air began to shift. What had been smooth choreography, ushers guiding guests, music swelling, lights catching on glass, suddenly fractured into whispers. The event coordinator, clipboard trembling in her hands, scanned the list again and again, her pen tapping nervously at the paper. One of the assistants leaned in, asking the same question a second time, a third time. "Where is the primary sponsor? Has anyone checked if he arrived?" Another voice, urgent, cut across. "He must be here. We received confirmation. Find him." The polished calm of the evening cracked. Runners darted between tables, their polite smiles fading as the urgency leaked into their faces. Volunteers flipped through printed programs, whispering hurriedly, their eyes scanning the crowd. Somewhere near the side doors, a phone rang, sharp and insistent. The coordinator answered, her voice breaking into fragments of apology and excuses. She lowered the phone slowly, her face pale, her eyes wide with something close to dread. The mayor's aide had called. The schedule could not proceed until the sponsor was in his seat. The speech, the unveiling, the announcement, all of it depended on a man they could not find. The audience did not yet know, but backstage, panic bloomed like fire. He saw pieces of it from his cold seat by the exit, ushers whispering more urgently now, their eyes darting from row to row, assistants rushing back and forth, their brows furrowed, their smiles rehearsed but brittle. A staff member pointed toward the guest list, shaking her head as though the paper itself had betrayed them. His name was nowhere. It had never been written. The man who had carried the weight of the night did not exist in their eyes, not on paper, not on stage, not in their plans. And yet he was there, sitting silently, his wristband cutting into his skin, watching them trip over their own blindness. They had stripped him of dignity, but now they were the ones unraveling. Their pride had overlooked him, and now their pride had left them exposed. The murmurs grew louder. A man in a headset rushed up the aisle, scanning faces with frantic eyes, pausing at every row, as though the sponsor might materialize from thin air. He stopped short of the back, his gaze sweeping over the exit doors, dismissing the quiet figure sitting there as just another nameless guest. The irony stung, but it also steadied him. Let them search, let them panic. The truth was already written, and truth never hurries. The coordinator disappeared backstage again. The clipboard clutched like a lifeline, and the whispers swelled into a restless hum. Guests began to notice now, leaning toward each other, asking why the program hadn't begun. A nervous laugh, a cough, another sip of champagne. The facade of control was cracking, spreading like spiderwebs across glass. And still he sat, calm as stone, the envelope pressing steady against his chest. He did not rise, he did not call out. The night belonged to truth, and truth would reveal itself in its own time. The more they scrambled, the more powerful its unveiling would be. The faces near the stage grew paler. The clock ticked louder. The tension thickened until the chandeliers themselves seemed to vibrate. And in the far corner, by the drafty doors, the man they had erased waited silently, patient, steady, as their panic built the stage for him without knowing it. The restless hum of the hall grew unbearable, like a sea of whispers crashing against the velvet curtains. The master of ceremonies shuffled his cards nervously, his polished voice faltering for the first time that evening. The microphone caught every inhale, every shaky pause, magnifying the tension that pressed into the room. He cleared his throat once, twice, eyes darting toward the wings where the coordinator stood pale and frantic, signaling with trembling hands. Then, with no place left to stall, he straightened, lifted the card, and spoke. The sound of his name filled the hall, full, clear, deliberate. Not the shortened version family used at home, not a casual surname muttered at a gathering, but the entire name and all its weight, spoken slowly, reverently, with a pause between each syllable, as though announcing a prize winner, as though unveiling a truth too large for the air to hold casually. For a heartbeat, the hall froze. Forks stilled in midair, glasses suspended before lips. And then, as if pulled by an invisible thread, every head turned. Faces craned, searching the rows. The chandeliers flickered above, light glancing off eyes wide with confusion. The honored guests in the front, twisted in their seats, whispers rising like sparks. In the shadows near the doors, he sat, unmoving, his name still reverberating in the air. His daughter's head snapped around, her painted smile collapsing. Her husband leaned forward, eyes narrowed, disbelief etched in every line of his face. The children, too young to mask their feelings, stared at him with astonishment, as if seeing their grandfather for the very first time. He did not rise. He did not wave. He let the silence work. The longer he sat, the heavier his name grew in the room, like a bell, tolling over a village, impossible to ignore. The irony burned in their faces, those who had laughed, those who had ushered him aside, those who had asked him to park in the mud, now realized they had dismissed the very man who carried the night on his shoulders. The host repeated his name, this time louder, this time with honor stitched into every syllable. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we celebrate with gratitude," his full name, "the principal benefactor of this evening, without whom none of this would be possible." The applause came in waves, hesitant at first, then rising until the sound filled the hall. People clapped as they turned, their eyes still searching for him, and in that tide of sound his daughter's face grew pale. The word she had once spoken in her heart, failure, was now drowned beneath the thunder of recognition. Her breath quickened, her hands trembling in her lap. The name she had erased from her stories was now written across the air, permanent, undeniable. He finally rose, slowly, with the calm dignity of a man who no longer needed to prove anything. The applause grew louder as the truth walked out of the shadows, and for the first time all evening, every eye in the hall was on him, not as a servant, not as a forgotten man, but as the pillar upon which their celebration stood. He rose from his seat at the edge of the hall, the draft from the doors still tugging at his coat, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. Then the applause swelled again, stronger this time, rolling like a wave from the front rows to the very back. The sound wrapped around him, pressing into the walls, lifting into the chandeliered ceiling. He stepped forward into the aisle, each stride unhurried, steady, as though he had been walking toward this moment his entire life. The guests shifted, parting instinctively, their eyes widening with every step he took. Some clapped harder, their faces glowing with sudden recognition, while others hesitated, guilt flickering across features that had only moments ago looked past him as if he were invisible. His name still lingered in the air, echoing from the lips of the master of ceremonies, and now it was written in light as well. The great screen above the stage blazed alive with his full name. This evening is made possible by the generous support of his full name. The letters glowed golden, enormous, undeniable. He saw heads turn sharply toward the banners draped along the walls, saw guests lean down to examine the printed programs in their hands. And there it was again, his name, etched clearly, not as a guest in the shadows, but as the foundation of the night itself. They had all held these pages, passed these banners, sat beneath this screen, yet not one of them had truly seen, until now. He walked on, the sound of applause rising with each step. The red carpet of the aisle, which had carried so many others before him, now seemed to stretch only for him. The children in the front rows rose slightly from their seats, clapping with excitement, unaware of the humiliation he had endured just hours before. The ushers who had blocked his way earlier now stood stiff, their faces pale, unable to meet his eyes as he passed. He did not glance at them. He had no need to. His daughter sat frozen, her face drained of color. She gripped the arm of her chair as though it might keep her from collapsing under the weight of the truth. Her husband shifted uncomfortably beside her, his jaw clenched, his gaze fixed on the floor. The children stared at him, mouths open, eyes wide with awe, realizing suddenly that their grandfather was not the small, quiet man they thought they knew. The applause thundered louder, filling the hall like a storm, and he let it wash over him. Yet there was no triumph in his expression, no smugness, no need to bask. His face remained calm, composed, as if he were reminding them all that this moment was not born of their recognition, but of the truth itself. He had given without asking, built without demanding thanks, and tonight the world was simply catching up to what he had always known. As he reached the front, the light seemed to follow him, illuminating not just his path, but the quiet dignity of every sacrifice that had brought him here. He stepped onto the stage, his name glowing behind him on the screen, engraved into the programs hanging from the banners. Everywhere they looked now, they saw him. Everywhere they turned, they could not escape the truth of who had carried them. And for the first time in years, he was no longer the shadow by the door, no longer the man sent to the far lot, no longer invisible. He was the pillar of the evening, the silent architect whose legacy had been hidden in plain sight. The applause still raged, but beneath it there was something heavier, something unspoken, the shame of those who had forgotten, and the dawning reverence of those who finally saw. They handed him the microphone, their eyes bright with anticipation, waiting for him to speak. The master of ceremonies gestured warmly, inviting him to address the hall, to take the stage as though he had waited all his life for this moment. But he did not lift the microphone. He only placed his hand gently over it, bowed his head slightly, and offered a small, grateful nod. The gesture was enough. It was all he needed to say, for the truth did not require his voice. The truth was already written across every corner of the hall. The next slide on the great screen flickered alive. Lists of contributions, lines of text illuminated against the golden backdrop. A hush swept through the audience as the numbers appeared. Scholarships funded, 120. Equipment for 3 schools purchased. Hall rental fully covered. Volunteer meals and housing paid in advance. Each item, each line, was louder than any speech he could have given. Each digit stood as his quiet whisper into the silence. I was there. I carried this. I gave, even when unseen. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Faces softened, eyes widened. Guilt washed across more than a few expressions. The weight of their earlier dismissals pressed into them now, undeniable, suffocating. Those who had nodded past him at the door, those who had smiled politely while blocking his way, now sat with hands folded tightly in their laps, unable to look directly at him. The same ushers who had guided him to the back row now avoided his gaze, their postures stiff with shame. He stood calmly as the hall absorbed the truth. He did not need to remind them of the nights he had gone without sleep, of the sacrifices he had made, of the small pleasures he had denied himself so that others might have this moment of beauty. He did not need to tell them about the tools sold, the meals skipped, the long walks home with empty pockets, but a firm heart. The list on the screen told it all. Each item was not just an expense, but a chapter of his life carved in silence. Each was a gift they had mistaken for luck, each a quiet hand that had lifted them without ever asking for thanks. The applause began again, softer this time, but deeper. It was no longer the applause of ceremony, no longer the clapping of people told to honor a name. It was raw, hesitant, rising from the depth of recognition. It was the sound of hearts moved by the weight of what they had overlooked for too long. He nodded once more, refusing still to speak. His silence was a kind of justice. It reminded them that he had never given for recognition, never demanded to be seen. He had given because it was who he was, because generosity was not about applause, but about legacy. And now, standing in the glow of screens and banners, his silence thundered louder than any words he could have spoken. In that silence, they all heard what he might have said if he had chosen to. I was always here, even when you dismissed me, even when you pushed me to the shadows. I was here, carrying you. The microphone was lowered, the screen remained lit, and the truth stood taller than him, taller than the chandeliers, taller than any boast uttered that night. She sat frozen in her chair, the applause crashing around her like a storm she could not escape. Her face, once radiant and proud as she boasted of her husband's connections, had drained of color. The rouge on her cheeks looked painted on stone. Her lips trembled as if she might say something, anything, but no words came. Her eyes, wide and glassy, stayed fixed on the stage where her father stood beneath the glow of his name. Her husband shifted beside her, but he too had no refuge. The confident set of his shoulders sagged, his jaw tightened as he stared at the floor. He had built his pride on the illusion of influence, on the stories of handshakes and nods from important people. But what weight did those whispers carry now, compared to this? One man, the one they had dismissed, had funded the very walls holding this event together. One man had carried the evening on his back, and it was not him. His silence was heavy, like a curtain falling, the collapse of a role he could no longer play. She felt the eyes of others turning toward her now, the sting of invisible judgment, the neighbors, the friends, the colleagues, those who had clapped politely when she bragged, those who had smiled at her carefully rehearsed stories, now looked past her, over her, through her. Their gaze landed only on him. Their applause belonged only to him. Her chest tightened with the memory of her own words, the cruelty she had spoken not long ago, the subtle ways she had cut him down. How many times had she rolled her eyes when he entered the room? How many times had she dismissed his advice, waved away his presence, treated him like a burden? And tonight, the final insult, she had let him walk to the far lot, had seen nothing wrong in letting him sit by the exit draft, nameless, unrecognized. She had agreed with the world's judgment of him as small, and now the truth towered above her, crushing her into the smallest version of herself she had ever been. The hall still clapped, but she could not. Her hands were stiff, cold, pressed against her lap as if nailed there. The word failure, the word she had once thought applied to him, rose up now like a mirror and seared itself onto her own face. Failure to see, failure to remember, failure to love. She had betrayed not only her father, but the very blood that gave her life. Her children, seated at her side, no longer looked at her with admiration. Their eyes glowed with something new as they stared at their grandfather. Respect. Awe. They saw in him what she had refused to. Dignity carved from sacrifice. Success written in deeds instead of words. And in their young faces, she saw the cruelest truth of all, that her blindness would not be theirs. They would remember him, not her husband's hollow pride, not her empty boasting. Her throat burned with the taste of tears she could not swallow. She lowered her gaze, unable to face the truth that wrapped the room. For the evening, for the applause, for the light, none of it belonged to her world anymore. It belonged to the man she had cast aside, the man she had shamed, the man she had thought would never be more than a shadow. And as she sat pale and trembling in the middle of the golden hall, she understood with painful clarity her father did not need her recognition anymore. He had been vindicated without her, above her, beyond her, and she would live with the shame of knowing that she had not just ignored him, she had betrayed him. He stood beneath the glow of the chandeliers, the hall still heavy with applause, and yet his face remained calm, untouched by triumph. There was no fire of vengeance in his eyes, no sharp edge of pride in his expression. He did not look at his daughter's pale face, nor at the bowed head of her husband, nor at the ushers who now shifted uncomfortably along the walls. He did not need to. Justice had already come, not in fury or shouting, but in a way more powerful than any confrontation could bring. The ropes that had once blocked his way were quietly unclipped. The velvet cords fell aside with a hush, the staff moving swiftly, their hands trembling as they removed barriers that no longer had the right to stand. The same guards who had gestured him back now stepped forward with lowered eyes, pulling the cordons away as though erasing their own mistake. What had excluded him moments ago now parted for him like the sea. He had not demanded it. His silence had demanded it for him. Someone appeared at his side with a new badge. Not the paper wristband that still clung to his arm like a mark of dismissal, but a polished plaque embossed with his full name. The staff member held it out with both hands, bowing their head as though it were an offering, their voice breaking in whispered apology. "Forgive us. We didn't—" The words died in the air, unfinished, too late. He accepted the badge gently, without gloating, without cruelty, simply because it was his already. Recognition, like truth, did not need his anger to make it whole. They hurried to clear a seat for him at the front, the best seat in the hall, the one directly facing the stage. Hands smoothed the cushion, polished the armrests, rushed to make it worthy of him. But he did not rush to take it. He walked with steady steps, each footfall louder in the silence that followed. People shifted in their chairs as he passed, some lowering their heads, others clapping again with desperate fervor, as though their applause could undo the years they had overlooked him. It could not. He lowered himself into the seat offered, his back straight, his presence unshakable. And in that moment, the hall changed. It was no longer the stage for others to bask in their vanity. It became a court of truth, and his silence was the verdict. He did not need to say a single word of reproach. The shame in his daughter's eyes, the nervous cough of her husband, the whispers in the crowd, they were the proof of justice already served. The apologies came in fragments, soft voices at the edges of the stage, people leaning close with murmured regret. But those apologies were not what filled the hall. What filled it was respect, raw, undeniable, rippling from every corner. Even those who had not known him before felt the weight of his presence now. They saw the man who had sat in the shadows and realized he had been the foundation all along. And so he remained silent, his dignity louder than any speech, his composure more powerful than any fury. Justice had come, not with fire, but with quiet force, breaking the ropes, changing the seats, rewriting the night. And in that quiet he knew there was nothing more to prove. He rose slowly, not in anger, not in triumph, but with a stillness that carried more weight than any speech. The hall quieted as he moved, the chandeliers glinting against the calm lines of his face. He did not wait for the ceremony to end. He did not need the final applause or the last polite words. His presence had already rewritten the night. And so he turned toward the doors, his steps steady, unhurried, each one echoing in the silence, like the toll of a bell. There was no pride in his exit, only peace. Pride seeks to be seen. Peace simply is. And as he walked down the aisle, people shifted in their chairs, standing, not out of obligation but out of reverence. Hands reached out instinctively, claps on his shoulder, murmured words he did not ask for. The faces that had once looked past him now glowed with respect, some even with shame, but he did not pause to absorb it. He had no need. Respect given late is still respect, and dignity does not linger to count debts. At the doors, where the draft had tormented him all evening, he was met with warmth instead. A young volunteer hurried forward, cheeks flushed, eyes bright with something more genuine than ceremony. The boy extended his hand and whispered, "Thank you." Not in the hollow way people speak it in passing, but with weight, with sincerity, as if the word itself had found its true meaning for the first time. Others followed. A woman pressed his hand between hers, her eyes shining with tears. An older man nodded deeply, unable to speak at all. And as he stepped into the night, it was not silence that followed him, but gratitude. The walk to his car no longer seemed long. The gravel that had soaked his shoes earlier now felt like nothing more than stones beneath the feet of a man who knew exactly where he stood. The lot, once dark and humiliating, seemed lighter now, as though dignity itself had illuminated the way. He unlocked his car slowly, the quiet hum of the engine filling the night, and paused for a moment to look back. The building glowed in the distance, alive with music, laughter, and light. But what lingered in the air was not the sound of the gala. It was the echo of his name, spoken in reverence, carried in applause, held now in hearts that could never again pretend not to know. He had entered unseen, dismissed, forgotten. He left recognized, respected, undeniable. And as he drove away, the night embraced him not as an exile, but as a man whose silence had carried more weight than every speech behind those walls. The morning after, the hall looked different. The music and laughter were gone. The chandeliers dimmed, the tables cleared away. Only silence lingered, heavy and reverent, as if the walls themselves were still absorbing what had happened the night before. Workers bustled about, sweeping floors and stacking chairs, but even their movements carried a hush, as though they knew they were standing in a place forever changed. By noon, a small crowd gathered near the entrance. They stood quietly, their voices subdued, waiting to witness something that would remain long after the last echo of applause had faded. The mayor himself appeared, not with speeches or fanfare, but with a brass plaque held firmly in his hands. Its surface gleamed in the sunlight, and the engraved letters shone with a permanence that no one could deny. Parking reserved, his full name, principal benefactor. The plaque was bolted into place at the very spot where only hours before he had been turned away. The same attendants who had once gestured him toward the mud now stood by with lowered heads, their faces flushed as the bolts tightened. With each strike of the hammer, the shame of the past night was sealed into memory, and the truth carved into permanence. Where there had once been dismissal, now there was honor. Where there had once been humiliation, now there was respect too solid to be moved. Passers-by stopped to read it, their whispers filled with awe. Some recognized the name instantly, recalling the applause, the unveiling, the truth that had spread through the hall like fire. Others asked who he was, and the answers came quickly. The man who made it possible. The one they had overlooked. The one whose name will remain here long after we are gone. His name was no longer just letters on a page, or a voice trembling on a microphone. It had become part of the place itself, part of its stone, part of its history. For his daughter, the sight was unbearable. She came quietly, her steps hesitant, her face pale. She had told herself that perhaps the night before had been a fever dream, that the glow of his name on the screen, the thunder of applause, might fade with the dawn. But here, under the sun, stood the truth in brass and steel. She ran her hand over the plaque, her fingers tracing the grooves of his name, and tears blurred her vision. She could no longer call him small. She could no longer erase him with silence. The building, the city, the people, all would remember him, whether she admitted it or not. And in that moment, she felt the weight of every careless word she had spoken, every dismissal, every time she had looked past the man who had given everything. But he, the man at the center of it all, did not seek her tears. He did not stand nearby to watch her shame. He did not even come to see the plaque himself. For him, the legacy had never been about signs or titles. It was about the quiet knowledge that he had lived a life of giving, of building, of lifting others higher even when they refused to see him. That truth was already written, deeper than brass, deeper than stone. And yet the plaque remained, gleaming for the world to see. Children passing by pointed to it and asked questions. Their parents explained his story in hushed tones. Volunteers paused, placing their hands over the letters as if to borrow strength from his name. Even the attendants who once dismissed him now guarded that space with reverence. No one could park there without remembering him. No one could walk through those doors without seeing what he had given. He was no longer the man pushed to the far lot, no longer the shadow at the door, no longer the invisible figure behind the laughter of others. He was the benefactor, the pillar, the foundation on which the evening had stood. His name, once unspoken, was now unerasable, and no betrayal, no slight, no dismissal, no indifference could ever strip that away. For the rest of their lives, those who had witnessed it would remember the night the forgotten man became unforgettable. And long after he was gone, his name would remain by those doors, etched in brass, whispering the truth he had carried in silence. That dignity does not need recognition, that sacrifice leaves a legacy, and that true worth can never be erased. And so the hall lived on, filled with light, filled with memory, carrying his name in every shadow and every stone. The man they had once overlooked had become eternal.